Hey everyone, welcome to NonTrivial. I'm your host, Sean McClure. In this episode, I talk about the role that magic, superstition, irrationality has played in human progress, specifically the so-called Enlightenment. I will use the life of Paracelsus, the Swiss physician, alchemist, and lay theologian of the German Renaissance, as an exemplar of one who paved the way for progress, yet believed wholeheartedly in things that today we would not associate with intellectual advancement. So I want to show how much of science and engineering came not from some departure from myth and magic, as the usual narrative goes, but because of beliefs in things that today seem counter to enlightened thinking. I will argue that there are strong evolutionary mechanisms behind superstition and irrational thinking, and that to continue making progress, humanity will need to return to magic. Let's get started. Okay, a return to magic, the illogical roots of progress. I will remind everyone, as I mentioned on the last episode, that if you would like to see some of the visuals that accompany this episode, head on over to Patreon. So for anyone willing to pay a little bit of money, they can see the visuals that I have put together that accompany my talk here. But of course, the audio is exactly the same. So if you just want the audio, go ahead and just continue listening to the podcast. But for Patreon subscribers, you can see the visuals. Okay. So a quick overview of what I'll be talking about in this episode. This is really about it's about a number of things. It's ultimately about the role that things like, superstition or religion or what we might think today as being almost outdated or fictitious thinking, right? When we think about science and progress, we think about objective, logical, rational thinking, and we kind of think of, much of that progress as removing ourselves from the myth and the magic that preceded it. The book that I'm going to use for this week's to anchor this week's presentation is called The Devil's Doctor by Philip Ball. The Devil's Doctor, Paracelsus and the World of Renaissance Magic and Science. So what I like about this book is it's an example of kind of that transition period or that intermediate period between, when basically all of society had some aspect to it that was, mythical, magical, a belief in superstition, a belief in, and of course religion plays a big role here. Basically people would anchor much of their life around things that they could not perceive, right? Because science wasn't here. We weren't measuring a bunch of things. We weren't trying to apply, logical thinking and mathematics to things. We didn't have, the scientific method in place. And so a lot of what drove society and the individuals within that society was a belief in things that today we would kind of consider maybe even a bit ridiculous, right? Myth and magical ideas and incantations. And of course we've got, witchcraft. And then of course there's the religious side of things. And so the purely scientific rational view that we have today supposedly departed from a lot of that. Okay. So today I want to talk about that transition period. I want to use Paracelsus' life in this book, The Devil's Doctor, as an example. And really what I'm going to argue in this episode is that the enlightened period that we're in now supposedly is not really a departure from myth and magic, and it wasn't the transition period wasn't one where people were removing themselves from those beliefs. Actually, they were quite causal. In fact, the belief in something beyond yourself, regardless of what that is, whether that's a religious thing or a spiritual thing, or a magic thing, whatever that is, that's actually critical to trying to make sense of the world, to motivate you to do it in the first place, to try to mechanize, the operations behind what you believe, is magical or is possible. And it's that actually motivates individuals and society at large towards things like science and technology. So I'll talk about what I mean, and ultimately I'll wrap that up at the end, which is, really we haven't departed from that in some ways, and in other ways we have, but that's kind of to the detriment of progress. And actually, we kind of need a return to that magic. So I'll tell you what I mean by that, and we'll look at some of the mechanisms, some of the concepts we'll be looking at or the patterns in this episode will be things like narrative fallacy, what I like to call the power of naivete, something I call indirect targets, this idea that the target that you're aiming at is not necessarily what you're going to get out of it. And so it's good to have targets that are actually quite unrelated to the ultimate thing that pops out, because the thing that pops out ends up being a byproduct. So we'll look at that. We'll take a look at some evolutionary mechanisms, and then universality, which kind of ties into the way Paracelsus was, understanding what today we would call healthcare, but how kind of he tried to mechanize the understanding of things that were related to alchemy and what we would call today as medicine. But anyways, we'll get into all of that. So let's get started. Again, this week's book is The Devil's Doctor by Philip Ball. So let's begin with a science narrative. What I mean by that is, when we take a look at modernity, right, modern society, science obviously plays a very large role. And the usual narrative there at a high level is science kind of broke away from superstition, right? Which seems to make sense. When we think about things scientifically, we are, supposedly looking at it quite objectively. We're trying to strip away a lot of the bias and the emotion. We're not trying to make claims about things that we can't measure. We want to make claims about things that we can measure. And even though there's still a decent amount of interpretation, we continually test that knowledge. Of course, we have the scientific method that, I've argued in the past isn't really followed, but so the narrative goes, we come up with hypotheses, and then we test those hypotheses, and then they do or they don't work. And if they don't work, we try it again. And we basically try to converge on some knowledge, right? We try to accumulate objective knowledge that is testable. And so the story that we're told about the Enlightenment, which is basically, again, this transition period where before the Enlightenment, you believed in things like superstition and magic and obviously a lot of religion. And then that Enlightenment came along and said, wait a second, let's not talk about things that we can't really prove, quote unquote, or at least show evidence for. Let's measure things and be objective about this. That's the Enlightenment, right? So the story that we're told about the Enlightenment is that men decided to break away from what I'll just kind of generally call superstition. The idea that increased objectivity and rationality supplanted, quote unquote, foolish beliefs in things that we cannot see. The idea that the origins of science must have bared the same patterns we see in science today. So, in other words, if there was a time in history where we started to break away from myth and magic or superstition, that it must have been people who were doing things that we associate with science today, right? I mean, it must have been individuals that said, no, I think myth is ridiculous. I think we shouldn't believe in superstition. I want to do this objectively. I want to start looking, it must have kind of been people doing what we're kind of doing today when we think about science. But the problem is, with this idea, something that I've called in the past, the pattern is not the path. In fact, I have a whole non-trivial episode called that, right? The pattern is not the path. And just to remind listeners, this idea that when you're looking at something today, it could be a phenomenon that you're measuring, scientifically. It could be a pattern in someone's life. It could be something that, looks successful, whatever it is. You're looking at it, you're measuring it, you're talking about it, has a pattern to it. You tend to think that, well, that must be the pattern going forward. In other words, if I want to continue to do this, just keep doing that pattern. And what I argue is that the pattern is not the path. So whatever emerged as the pattern that you're looking at is not the recipe to get there. Okay, and I gave a number of examples in that episode, so you guys can, if you haven't already, listeners can go listen to that episode, The Pattern is Not the Path. But this is an example of that. We're looking at science, looking at technology, and we can see the logic in it. We can see how things, seem to add up, and it's very objective. And when you're making a scientific argument, you tend to leave the majority of emotion out of it because you see that as bias, and it just doesn't follow the logical path. So we tend to think that, well, if we want to do more science, we should be like that, right? We should continue to try to be objective, and we continue to try to strip away emotion and bias and a lot of that kind of organic, messy human stuff and focus on just what is, just focus on the facts. That must be the pattern forward. And that must also be the pattern backwards, meaning the people that were part of this transition period, the people that were part of bringing the Enlightenment must have had some aspect of that to them, right? That pattern of stripping away a lot of that messy complexity and a lot of that emotional bias and belief in things that we would today maybe deem as foolish, they must have been part of that journey of trying to strip that away. But I'm going to argue that's not the case. That whether you're going forward or whether you're going back, we'll do the forward stuff a little bit later in the episode when I talk about a return to magic, that I don't think the pattern, I don't think the way forward is a focus on objectivity and logic. I think that's a bit of a myth that science works like that. But looking back, it's also incorrect. It's also really a narrative fallacy to say that, the men of the time that were ushering in the Enlightenment must have just been more focused on, like logic and rational thinking than they were on myth and magic. And I don't think that's true. And we can back that up with historical accounts. And part of that is this book, The Devil's Doctor, right? When we look at Paracelsus. So, a little bit more on on magic and the Enlightenment. So is magic, and I'm using these terms essentially interchangeably, magic, superstition, myth, even religion. For now, let's just kind of bundle those into one category, right? Things that you don't directly measure and do, scientifically, right? Did the Enlightenment overcome that old thinking? Or was such thinking the cause? We kind of have this Dark Ages myth, right? The Dark Ages, where humans weren't maybe producing that much in the way of technology or in the way of of thinking that would have led to progress. So we've got this narrative that there is, this Dark Ages that came before the Enlightenment, right? So there's this kind of magic versus Enlightenment, or magic versus science. But the other way of thinking about it is that it was actually the cause, because if it wasn't magic or the belief in superstition or something, beyond yourself that you couldn't perceive, that wasn't driving science, then what was it? What was the aim? Because it's not that, a serious amount of logic existed within many of the people that brought in the Enlightenment. It's not like you had this big mathematical arsenal with which to use. Again, it's this anachronism to kind of look back and assume that, people kind of had what we had today, but of course they didn't, and they weren't thinking the way we thought today. And so you got to put yourself in their shoes. You have to really try to think about what it was like back then. It wasn't a scientific world. It wasn't a mathematical world. It wasn't a super logical world. It was full of myth and full of magic. And that, chances are, regardless of who you were, that is what you believe. That is how you were brought up. And even if part of you maybe were kind of skeptical of it, you didn't have the lens that you have today with which to try to be skeptical. So you really would have doubted yourself, even if you were, having some skepticism around that. So if it wasn't, logic or math or things we associate today that was the aim, then what was the aim back then? Well, there wouldn't have been an aim unless it was this idea of myth and magic. In other words, if you were trying to explain the world, you were trying to explain the things that you believed, right? The things that you thought about, the superstitions that you had, the magical incantations that would have led to stuff. That's kind of what you were trying to mechanize. In other words, your interest in the world around you wouldn't have been maybe the way scientists think today, where they're looking at, biology, the way we think of biology, plant and animal life, or things in the universe. Now we've got all these pictures of the stars and the galaxies, and, they didn't have access to any of that. So what was the interest? What was the aim back then? Well, I think the aim was the magic, right? The aim would have been to explain not, necessarily how do plants and animals grow and do what they do. I mean, there would have been some of that, but it was more through the lens of, how did God bring this to be? Or how does, the life force inside of an element, cure someone, if that's what you believe, or improve your life? Why does, the alignment of the stars, from a astrological point of view, why does that either do good things or bad things? Why does it allow the crops to come up or not? That whatever you were believing from a mythical standpoint, that's what you were trying to essentially understand on a deeper level. So that was the aim. It wasn't people back in time thinking, well, I need to be more logical. I need to separate myself from myth. It was the explanation of the myth. So that was the target. So when we think about the Enlightenment, and we think about things like magic, magic is not the antithesis of progress. It was very much the goal that drove people towards what we now call the Enlightenment. So I think, again, going back, there's this bit of science narrative, which is largely a narrative fallacy, that the people back in the day were separating themselves from myth and magic. Not at all. They were aiming towards it. They were trying to understand the myth and magic more deeply. And that is what brings us to what we would now call this kind of enlightened thinking. So there's this causal aspect. Okay. And keep that in mind as we start thinking about what we should be doing going forward. Okay. I'll start talking about how there's this kind of self-dampening, there's this mitigating aspect to thinking that the pattern forward is more logic and more mathematics. I think there's actually something wrong with that. And that doesn't mean logic and math are bad. But again, there's a difference between what your target is and what the byproduct of something is. We'll get into that. But looking backwards is also problematic. This idea that, the Enlightenment must have came from logical, rational thinking. No, a lot of that didn't even exist. I think that's an anachronism to assume that people could look at the world through that lens. The lens they were looking at the world through was very much one of myth and magic, and that is causal to their deeper inspection of those things, of those perceptions, of those ideas. Okay, so magic and enlightenment are not different things. You take away the magic, you take away the chance of achieving the so-called enlightenment. So now let's talk about Paracelsus a bit. And again, I talked about the book being the anchor to this episode, The Devil's Doctor. So Paracelsus was a number of things, but alchemist is maybe the best title. He's also part philosopher, part theologian. Someone who was involved in what we would now call medicine, I suppose, although not quite anywhere near as advanced. The alchemist background. So alchemy is obviously, this idea of basically transmutation. You can take substances and you can turn them into other things. And the reason why you would want to do that is because you think those new things that you can create would be useful. If this sounds familiar, then it should. It sounds very much like chemistry. Today's chemistry, the roots are very much alchemy, right? The difference being that today's chemistry is obviously more evidenced by, again, objective approaches to measurement, not so much proven, because in a way you don't really prove anything in science, but they're much more grounded in reproducible, experimental, evidenced things, as opposed to, the philosopher's stone, or this idea that, you can turn lead into gold, or if you were to mix, mercury with something else and rub it on a wound, that maybe that's good for you. Alchemy was very much the beginnings of what we would now consider, chemistry. But of course, it was not backed by evidence. It was, not completely devoid of evidence, but nothing like today. It was very much, hocus pocus. It was mixing things together. It was believing that, when materials had certain properties, it wasn't because of some, underlying physics or chemistry like we know today. It was because of, a life force, or maybe the way, the stars were aligned, or the way that you held it, things that you might see in movies today that are more based on myth and magic. So believing materials contained a kind of life force that could be harnessed, via the mixing and matching of materials and the application of those materials to largely to people. That's alchemy. And Paracelsus is kind of the prototypical example of the alchemist. He became very well known during the German Renaissance. He traveled all over the place. I mean, the book goes into the details. It's a pretty interesting life, actually. And he believed that he had the ability to exploit the forces within these materials, if you will. And he had good reputations in certain places of the world and really bad reputation in other places of the world. Some people thought he was a charlatan. Some people thought he was almost next to godly with his abilities. And of course, there's all kinds of narrative on that. But what's interesting about Paracelsus as a character is that, really he wanted to understand his beliefs more deeply. So going back to this idea of, what was the aim? Is it, magic versus science, magic versus the Enlightenment, or is it magic as kind of a causal? Paracelsus is a really good example of someone whose deep beliefs in alchemy, myth, magic, superstition, his want to understand, his need to understand those more deeply, as any, philosopher or deep thinker would, is really what drove him to start to kind of think about things in a more kind of mechanistic fashion. Now, he got nowhere near what, medicine would be considered today, but that was the push and that was the aim. And so Paracelsus is that quintessential example of someone who was looking through the lens looking at life through the lens that was available to him at the time, and it was very much full of myth and magic, and that pushed him to try to understand what we would now call chemistry, right? What we would now call materials and how things got together and the effect and what were the causes behind them. That was very much the aim. So this is really about making sense of magic, not magic versus logic, not magic versus science, not magic versus the Enlightenment, but magic as the aim, making sense of magic. And there's this, anthropologist, Bronislaw Malinowski, who calls this ritualizing optimism. So science resulted not from the effort to get rid of magic, but from the effort to make sense of it. And Malinowski said this making sense of magic is a way of ritualizing man's optimism. So man goes through life and he believes in these really big things, and then you start to add ritual to it, and that starts to add a type of logic, a step-by-step approach to the way that you understand that magic. So that ritualizing optimism is this connection between belief in something as quote-unquote foolish as, let's say, myth and magic, and what we would now consider science. And so Paracelsus's religious thinking merged seamlessly with his chemical philosophy of the universe. That's what they say in the book. His religious thinking merged seamlessly with his chemical philosophy of the universe. These were not stark different things, right? His religious, magical, mythical thinking was not in juxtaposition or in contrast to the philosophy of the universe and the rituals and the mechanisms that were starting to be teased out. They were very much intertwined. Where you have someone like Martin Luther in history who distrusted reason, Paracelsus did not distrust reason. He believed that reason, rational thinking, could be used to understand the supernatural. Okay, so again, we have myth and magic being the aim, being the causal root of things that lead to the Enlightenment going forward. And so we have this evidenced power of ritual. So there's actually been a number of studies done, and there's this article in Scientific American that gives some kind of funny examples, but actually also provides some of the research to back this up. This idea that there's a performance enhancement via unrelated custom. So, for example, you talk about rituals, you talk about kind of superstitions. Apparently Michael Jordan wore his North Carolina shorts underneath his Chicago Bulls shorts in every game. Okay, now most of us would say it's obviously a bit ridiculous, a bit silly. That's just a superstition, or that's just some ritual that he has, and he believes that's going to improve his game. Of course, there's no scientific reason to believe that wearing, a pair of shorts underneath another pair of shorts is going to somehow improve your game. And there's all kinds of other examples, and this article kind of goes through them. But superstitious rituals are actually shown to enhance people's confidence, which makes sense, because even if it's complete nonsense, it might, for whatever reason, if you believe it, that's going to make you more confident. But that confidence is going to start to leak into your abilities, and that's going to motivate greater effort. And you can actually do the studies on this, and it shows that there are performance benefits from pre-performance routines. And, there's things like emotional stability and confidence. So you think about a ritual as being kind of ultimately pointless if you just look at it objectively. If you kind of take the thin slice through reality and say, okay, everything before your performance, whether that's sports, or singing or science or philosophy, whatever it is you're embarking on, if we can't see the connection, the direct deterministic connection between this little ritual that you have at the beginning and what ends up happening in the moment, then we're going to think of that ritual as being pretty pointless. You're following these steps, you have this ceremony, you have these customs, but it really has nothing to do with whatever you're trying to be good at, whatever you're trying to perform. So is that pointless? Well, this is where we step back and we start thinking about, is it really just, maybe it's a little boosting confidence and maybe that improves you, but there's really no connection to this ritual. Let's think about this from an evolutionary standpoint, okay? Because the reality is that behaviors that appear irrational do exist for a reason. Okay, people are more likely to perform rituals in situations of extreme uncertainty. Okay, now why would that be? Now this makes sense if you just step back and think about this, right? If there is something that's really, really uncertain, which probably means you have fear attached to it, a lot of nervous energy, a lot of anxiety around a situation, that's when people's rituals will tend to kick in. I mean, even, the atheists might find themselves praying if someone had a gun to their head or they were about to, fall over a cliff or something like that. In that would be, of course, the very extreme example. But anytime there's more uncertainty coming into the situation, humans tend to get more ritualistic. And the ritual might not be connected to reality directly, but the behavior might still save your life, right? There could be something in the ritual that is changing your behavior, and then that behavior makes you do something that protects you. Being paranoid, for example. You might you might be introduced into a more uncertain situation, and then you start to get paranoid about things that you don't really have any evidence for. And so you start to pull back a bit. But that behavior from an evolutionary standpoint might be critical to your survival. You might do this with, healthcare. There might be, maybe you avoid things like drinking a lot, or as a better example would be something like maybe like MSG, where you don't really have evidence, very strong evidence that this is bad for you, but you kind of get paranoid about it. So you start to not consume things that you don't know about. And so maybe there's an evolutionary reason to do that, because nobody needs MSG. Nobody needs maybe a lot of fruit sugar or whatever it is you're trying to avoid. So your paranoia, even though it's not really evidenced by anything, of course, as I've argued before, you're always going to find studies on both sides of the fence, but it's not that you have a strong amount of evidence for your behavioral change, but you do it anyway, and it ends up kind of protecting you. I'll give you an example in a couple minutes. But what I'm trying to argue here is that if you have extreme uncertainty, humans get more ritualistic, and that ritualism changes their behavior, and that behavior from an evolutionary standpoint can protect them. And it doesn't just have to be protecting, it could do other beneficial things as well, but it can lead to a benefit. So ritual exists for a very powerful reason from an evolutionary standpoint. And so we got this idea, I've got this picture on the slide here. You've got your direct target, and then you've got to the side of that the outcome that is actually useful. So ritual, myth, magic, religion, customs, when that is your target, that doesn't mean the benefit that you get from that target is even related. It could be a byproduct. And we don't see the causal connection, but there's a reason for it to exist. Okay, let me give you a more specific example. So hopefully I'm not confusing them. So superstition and evolution. So there's this quote, Nassim Taleb has written about this as well. Never discount anything that allows you to survive, even if you don't know why, right? Never discount anything that allows you to survive. Okay, so let's use an example. So imagine there is, a tribe somewhere that has this superstition. Taleb gives this example that, never sleep under dead trees, right? Never sleep under dead trees. And you can say, why? I don't know. It's just their custom. It's been like that maybe hundreds, thousands of years. They don't sleep under dead trees. Maybe they think the dead tree has an evil spirit to it. Maybe, it's not that there's any super logical mechanism behind it that they know of, that anybody knows of. They just have this baked into their culture. Dead trees, maybe they're evil. Maybe they set you up badly for life. Don't sleep under dead trees. Now, if I'm just looking at that through that thin kind of objective lens, seems kind of ridiculous, but there could actually be a rational reason for that. Maybe dead trees are, have a higher propensity to fall on you, which would make sense, right? You got rotting roots. Maybe a dead tree could tip over. Maybe it could kill you, or maybe there's some other aspect to it. What if there's, I don't know, a virus that attaches itself to decaying trees that could end up being bad for human life? What if there is, and on and on and on. You can come up with all kinds of examples. Now, the mistake is to try to look at that and say, well, I wonder if there really is a reason. No, who cares? That's not the point. That superstition exists for a reason. It could be that people with that superstition are the ones who survived, right? If we're talking thousands of years from a civilization standpoint, if a culture standpoint, if we're talking millions of years in terms of hominid evolution, these superstitions exist for a reason. Remember, the people that are here today to talk about it and their ancestors survived. And so they survived by having these beliefs. And so it's not for us to know whether or not they have any direct connection to reality or not. It's just that realistically, their beliefs led to a change in behavior. And that behavior was either neutral or beneficial, right? Probably beneficial, though. So there probably is something to not sleeping under dead trees that does help you and your ancestors survive. Now, you can try to pick apart what that is. Is it a viral thing? Is it things just don't fall on you as much, whatever. It doesn't matter. Superstition changes behavior. Behavior makes you survive or not. And the ones that are here today to talk about it and their ancestors are the ones that had superstitions that survived. So why am I talking about this? So superstitions can be, vectors for risk management rules, as Nassim Taleb says. Superstitions are potent information that people have and has allowed them to have survived and to repeat that survival going forward. Okay? There's this idea of constructive paranoia. So, regardless whether a superstition, whether you're using superstition or some deep scientific understanding of probability, it's really one and the same, right? It's really one and the same. I mean, at the end of the day, these are, superstitions are a way to deal with massive uncertainty. And you could actually look at it from a probabilistic standpoint and realize, oh, this actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, you aim over here, but that's unrelated, but that acts as an anchor going forward. And so probabilistically, this changes your behavior and it reduces your risk and yada, yada, yada. You can get all, you can nerd out on it and talk about, discounting and risk management rules. And you could realize, yeah, that seems smart. Or you could just look at it from an evolutionary standpoint and say, look, these are the people that survived. And they probably survived because they had the right behavior. And they probably had the right behavior because they had superstitions. So superstition is just, it's not just some, remnant of old society or old evolutionary whatever that, maybe is still with us. And we find, a lot of psychologists, a lot of people still talk about it as though we've got, biases and superstitions that really shouldn't be here. They don't apply to modern life anymore. They're from the 50,000-year-old brain that we have. And, unfortunately, they're still there. But you kind of have to overcome those. And that's starting to become an outdated mode of thinking as we realize that no, these are powerful evolutionary mechanisms that exist that allow us to solve very complex problems. Psychologists often try to disrupt our organic paranoid mechanism, as Taleb has said. And it's true because, a psychologist will want to try to look at something purely from an objective standpoint. And in doing so, will discount things like myth and magic as just being nothing but superstition and doesn't play any kind of survival role, but it really, really does. And I'm going to argue it's not just in the old world that had a use. I'm going to say it's still very much with us, maybe even more, because of the complexity increase of our technology and of our surroundings and of the world that we live in. So I'll get into that. So superstition and evolution are tied. It's not just believing in something ridiculous. There is a very strong reason for it to be there, regardless of whether it's connected directly to reality. Things that are connected directly to reality actually aren't that useful. And I'm going to argue that in a bit as well. I mean, this idea that, science, I talk about this, the reductionism, right? You reverse engineer, you look at the components and everything. All those components are supposed to be deterministically adding up to the outcome. That is a very outdated idea and approach to science. It's just, I can't stress that enough. It's very not a lot of that simplistic stuff has been figured out decades and decades ago. We talk about the failure of the Human Genome Project. We talk about the failure of theoretical physics the last 30 years. This all ties into this outdated notion that science is supposed to reverse engineer and understand the components, which are, I've called this the great disconnect, right? I had an episode on science saying more, but explaining less, right? This whole idea. As we go forward into more complex worlds, dealing more with more emergent phenomena, leaving behind the simplistic things that have been figured out in kind of old school physics and chemistry, but that are unfortunately still with us. We've got to get away from this idea that, you can strip away and extract in order to define something, right? It's much more emergent. It's much more causally opaque. And so these targets that are not deterministically related to the outcome become more and more important. Okay. So things like myth, magic, superstition, I'll talk about what I mean. What does that mean today, right? I'll talk about that in a bit, but keep that in mind. So there are strong evolutionary reasons why things like superstition, myth, magic, religion exist. They are actually quite causal to this so-called enlightened thinking that we have, because people tried to explain the myth and magic. That was the lens that they were looking at. And going forward, we're going to see that this is actually quite critical. So the mechanics of magic is really what I want to get at right in this episode. Self-delusion, if that's what you want to call it, think of that as a necessity. right? Magic told us what buttons to push to get an outcome. Now, it failed all the time, but the belief was that if the stars align, if you inhale the mercury vapors, yes, that was a thing, it made people's teeth come really loose. But anyway, for whatever reason, they believed it, right? If you do this to lead, right, supposedly it's going to become gold. All these crazy ideas. But it was mechanistic because it said it wasn't just believe in this and your life is good. It was trying to tell you what buttons to push to get the outcome. And of course, that's science, no matter how complex it is, right? At the end of the day, you've got inputs and you've got outputs, and you're always trying to map or correlate the inputs to the outputs. So that obsession with correlation comes out of magic, right? It comes out of this belief in something that you don't know how it works and you want to know how it works. Right now, the failures that would have happened all the time with alchemy and incantations and even proper religions where they might say something from the Bible, the earth is the absolute center, whatever, and then this starts to become challenged by what we view. Failures are just explained away as kind of a quote unquote poor incantation. Well, you weren't doing the incantation right. You didn't interpret it right. You didn't interpret, the Bible correctly. You didn't interpret the Quran, whatever the religion is, or the superstition, the myth, the magic. It's not the magic that's wrong. It's not the superstition that's wrong. It's not the religion that's wrong. It's just a poor implementation of it, right? So however you want to interpret that, self-delusion, a ridiculous belief in something, why are you still anchoring yourself on that? You can't see it. That quote-unquote self-delusion is the lifeblood of progress. Self-delusion is the lifeblood of progress. Now, again, whether or not it's actually delusional, you can decide for yourself, but I'm just using that as a label, right? That's self-delusion. The belief in the impossible, the belief in what you cannot see, you cannot perceive, the magic, what we might deem foolish today, has been the absolute lifeblood of progress. Because it tells you, if you push this, this is the outcome you're supposed to get. It makes you, obsessed with causality. It makes you want to understand things at a deeper level. It is the lifeblood of progress, not something that's diametrically opposed to it. Now let's get a little bit deeper in this idea of the mechanics of magic. Something that I'm really big on, and this relates to like a proper interpretation of Occam's razor. How do things get created? How do things become the right structure? So I've got this visual here for the Patreon subscribers, but what I have on the left, I've got this top kind of wrong structure, so it's just some dots connected with lines, and at the bottom I've got the right structure, and it's kind of this evolution from the wrong to the right. So this could be anything that you're doing. You could be building software, putting a program together, some not-profit organization, it doesn't matter, whatever it is you're creating, a shed, like, doesn't matter. You're trying to build something, right? It doesn't even have to be physical, right? It could be coming up with a plan for something, a way of thinking about the world, whatever it is. Think of it as a structure, as a number of concepts or physical things that are connected in a certain way. And you've got to try to get to the right structure. How do you create the right thing? Well, there's all this epistemic uncertainty there, right? Because you don't really know. Unless you're replicating something, you don't really know. If you're replicating, you just look at the blueprint, the design. You say, okay, I'm just going to build the same thing. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about coming up with something new, like genuine creativity. Well, the epistemic uncertainty there is absolute. There's no, and what that means is there's no way you're going to access the information you need to create the right thing at the beginning. At the beginning, you're never going to, there's no way to get that information. It doesn't matter. There's nothing in the universe that can help you there, right? The information on what the right structure is supposed to be is not available at the beginning because this is a complex problem that has causal opacity. We can't access that information. So the epistemic uncertainty is absolute. So the only way to get to the right structure is to put a structure together, regardless how wrong it's obviously going to be, because you're naive. You have to naively create something. You have to put something into the real world, right? And let certain pieces die and let certain pieces survive. So very much trial and error. And this is the real reason behind Occam's razor. So Occam's razor is, obviously a number of ways we can, don't multiply the unnecessary assumptions. There's all many different ways you could word this, but the kind of colloquial way of saying Occam's razor is the simplest theory is the correct one, right? So put the simplest theory forward. The reason why that is not because simple is good or simple is easy to understand. The real reason, and I've talked about this before, is because simple is easy to kill. Right? Vague things are hard to understand. They're hard to interpret. So you don't really know if it's right or wrong, but simple things, you know right away if it's wrong. So Occam's razor, which says do what's simple, right? The simplest theory is the correct one. Don't multiply too many assumptions, however you want to word that. Simple is good. The reason why simple is good is because it allows you to put something out there that can be destroyed quite easily. It's not vague. It doesn't have things that you can't really understand because vague things live too long, right? Because their vagueness makes it hard to kill. Simple things allow it to be destroyed, and that's what you want, things to be destroyed very rapidly so that you can converge towards the right structure. So why am I talking about this? So from wrong structure to right structure requires that you put simplistic things in place. So the simple thing that you're putting in place so that you can do the trial and error to get to the right thing is very naive. And what I'm arguing here is that naivete is required to move forward because something has to be destroyed to coax the information from the environment. Okay, it's another reason why stupid questions are really important. People don't like asking stupid questions, or they always preface it, I have a stupid question, because they always feel a bit guilty. Stupid questions are the absolute most critical questions you should always be asking because their simplicity will coax the information out from the environment that you need. If you instead don't want to ask the stupid question, so either you don't ask a question, which means you get no information at all, or you be kind of vague, or you put a bunch of jargon in there to kind of buffer or protect yourself so that you don't sound stupid, you're not going to get very good information out because your vagueness means that whoever you're asking the question to doesn't really understand exactly what you're asking. And you don't even really understand what you're asking, right? So you're being vague to kind of protect yourself to maybe sound a little bit smarter. But because nothing can be destroyed in what you're saying, you don't end up coaxing out good information. It's the same thing with physical things or informational things. But if you're kind of naive and you ask a really quote unquote dumb question, it will either survive or not right away. Okay, and that is the true purpose of Occam's razor right there. You want to put the simple thing forward again and again to get the right information. Okay, so you need wrong structures, naive, quote unquote stupid things to make progress. So why am I talking about this? I'm tying this back to the idea of magic, right? Of superstition, even religion. And that's not to call these things stupid, obviously, but quote unquote stupid, right? This idea that you're doing something that on the surface seems quite naive, right? Like, why are you talking about things you can't see, that you can't measure? Why are you can't back up anything you're saying? Why do you believe so wholeheartedly? That is required. Because the naivete baked into it is what allows information from the environment to be folded back in. It was the belief in magic, the belief in superstition that allowed people to mechanize their world, to understand things at a deeper level, regardless of whether the magic was real or not. Right? Again, going back to this diagram on the right, I have this wrong structure at the beginning. If you looked back with a hindsight bias and said, well, that was a really stupid design. No, next time, we're not going to start with such a dumb design. We're going to try to, no, you really should start with a dumb design next time. Because it's not, if you're creating something new, you have to start naively. So the evolution of progress from pre-enlightenment to post-enlightenment, or in enlightenment, whatever we're in now, right? That requires the naive thinking, regardless of whether the naive thinking is true or not. We can debate that. That's not what I'm here to debate. I'm just saying you have to not know. You have to put what you don't know forward. You have to believe in something that you can't see, that you can't perceive, however you want to interpret that, in order for progress and in this case, science and technology to actually progress the way it is. Okay, it's a narrative fallacy. It's a hindsight bias. It's an anachronism to go back in time and say the beginnings must have looked like the end. No, they never do. They never do, because it's not a deterministic connection like that. We're not talking billiard balls that bump into each other to produce an outcome. We're talking about massively complex constructs within reality. So the mechanics of magic are very much about using naivete, about believing in what you cannot see, about being quote unquote stupid. Just like a stupid question is super powerful. because of its ability to be part of the evolutionary process. Vague questions cannot be part of the evolutionary process, so they cap you off. People who don't know a lot ask quote unquote smart questions a lot. People who know a lot are always fearlessly willing to ask the stupid questions. So hopefully you see the connection between those two. The belief in the magic, the belief in the naive, you have to just enter the environment without knowing. And that's what myth and magic is. It's very much wholeheartedly believing in things that you can't see. You probably believe you can feel them, right? You have your own kind of version of evidence, but it's not the evidence that we associate with science and technology today. That naivete is critical. It's not a remnant from something in the past. It's absolutely critical. So there's this comparison that comes up in the book, The Devil's Doctor, Doctors versus Surgeons. Paracelsus did not like the university people. He did not like the educational system. There was way too much theory. There was not enough praxis, right? Not enough practical application. The doctors of the day who were purely kind of theoretical, they're almost just doing things for show. They're very ostentatious. They like to dress up. They like to be a doctor for the sake of being a doctor. Unfortunately, I think that's actually quite prevalent today as well. But back then, there was no the surgeon, in contrast, who actually had to deal with the cadavers or the live bodies, obviously, and it was very messy. It was dirty work. They were kind of looked down upon. Not like today, actually. I mean, surgeons are obviously quite respected alongside doctors. But back then, the doctors who were theoretical, they didn't get very messy. But because of that, Paracelsus was very critical of their knowledge. I said their knowledge is garbage because it's just so separated from reality. Whereas the surgeons had to be doing the real thing. So what led to progress? Was it the theory or was it more of the practical? It's very much the practical, and this kind of gets into this idea. Again, you've got to jump into the world and do the thing. I mean, the surgery, especially at the time, was extremely naive. They didn't know what they were doing. I'm sure they made all kinds of mistakes, but that's what led to the knowledge, right? Theory is always after the fact. This notion that theory precedes certain aspects of practical application, I think that's largely incorrect. I think it's largely correct because the epistemic uncertainty in these situations, particularly new situations, is always absolute. You have to have the practical application of things. So anyways, I thought that was interesting, the doctors versus surgeons example. So it just kind of shows some of Paracelsus's thinking, right? Is you got to naively go into the world and seize. And now again, remember, Paracelsus believed in superstition and alchemy and myth and magic. He was a theologian. He was very much not looking through the lens of pure objectivity. He wasn't arguing for praxis because he was trying to strip himself away from myth and magic. It was his attempt to explain the myth and magic that led him to the practical interaction with reality, as opposed to just sitting back and theorizing about it. So we recognize the importance of hands-on practice today, and you might think, well, that seems like such a separation from things like myth and magic. But again, no, it was his belief, Paracelsus's belief in the alchemy and in the magic that pushed him towards the practical applications of things as a superior form of knowledge. So this is really about indirect targets, and that's what I want to talk about right now. The true purpose of a goal is to never achieve it. Okay, the true purpose of a goal is to never achieve it. There's a big difference between what you're aiming at and what you're going to get. The bottom right, I've got that image again where you've got the direct target, but then you've got the actual useful outcome as being a byproduct. And if you think about your own life, you should realize this is the case. You were probably aiming all through your life. You have these goals and try to achieve them, but a lot of times they don't happen, and that seems disappointing. But then because of that push, you ended up achieving something that often was even more aligned with who you are and led to better outcomes. And so we see this all the time. And if you really stop and think, you'll realize you had all these targets throughout life. You failed all the time at them, but because you kept pushing towards those targets, you ended up getting a bunch of great stuff out of it. And so, again, I think it's anachronistic to look back and assume that today's paradigm of science and technology had recognizable roots, that the people who were, let's say, led to what we have today were aiming towards things that look like today. They weren't. They were aiming for very different things. The myth, the magic, the beliefs, the stuff that we don't associate with science and technology at all today, those were the goals. And that's why it led to what we have today. So the authors, so-called, of what we see today, not a big fan of, thinking about there being authors to things, because again, there's so much, there's mountains of contributions that lead to things. But the characters, the authors of what we see today, were unlikely to have been focused on recognizable outcomes, right? There's an unfortunate power of narrative fallacy. And that's why we keep getting stuck into it. Again, the pattern is not the path. We look at the pattern today and then we say, oh, that must have been where it came from. And that must be the way forward. But it's not. The targets are often very indirect to what the outcome is. And this just gets back to the epistemic uncertainty of situations. You can't know what leads to the outcome, but you do need to keep working at something and let the trial and error constantly happen, and let that constant push. All you need is the push. It almost doesn't matter where it's targeted, right? You need to push and then reassess, and push and then reassess. And in many ways, the more unrealistic that target, the more indirect that target, that can even be better, because you just need to sample from reality. You need to go into the world and sample access different information, see how that comes together, and through iteration is the only way you're going to get to the right structure. So the target, I think people make the mistake a lot. It's like, well, I know what I want to achieve in life, and so I'm going to keep trying to target towards that. That's often, in some sense, we have to do that because we're always naive. But as long as you have that willingness to keep failing, because that target that you have is not going to be achieved, but that doesn't mean you don't achieve something better, right? So Paracelsus's own contributions to alchemy had a profound impact on the development of the science of chemistry specifically. But we should never forget that this was not his intention. Okay, and that's straight out of the book, right? Paracelsus's own contributions to alchemy had a profound impact on the development of the science of chemistry, but we should never forget that this was not his intention. Going even deeper in terms of how we think of science and technology, we get into this idea of general patterns and universality. So the motivations of religion, a belief in something supernatural, makes one believe things are universally applicable. And this is really core to the drive to scientific progress and technological progress, is not just looking for how something specific works, but very much generalizing that, right? That's what we do in science. We generalize that out, because if I figure out how this specific things works, but then I can apply it to all kinds of other things, now I really have a powerful knowledge, right? A powerful type of knowledge that is more general, right? It's the reason why, Einstein's general relativity is much more powerful than his special relativity, right? Because something that is general is much more applicable and says something much more far reaching about the universe, right? Well, it's a belief in the supernatural that tends to make one believe things are universally applicable, because the religious thinking, the superstitious thinking, the mythological thinking, it makes you think everything's connected, right? It makes you think that something isn't just about this rock, this stone, about this tree, about that star. You think things affect other things, right? Now, again, whether that's how, the stars aligning actually affecting my life, that might not be true. But me thinking that, naively thinking that is the case, makes me, if it's me, whoever it is, start to think, if I'm hundreds of years ago, it would make me think that things are universally connected, that patterns are general, that they have this universal aspect to them. And that is at the absolute core of scientific thinking. That is really what leads to scientific to progress. So anything that can motivate you to explain things that are universally true, because you think everything is connected to everything, that's what's powerful. So again, going back to superstition, myth, magic, religion being the causal factor in much of progress, right? Paracelsus was they talked about in the book, was a massive fan of analogy, right? And that's, again, analogy is to the mental ability to connect what seems like disparate things, right? But they share at some level of abstraction, two things that are seemingly different share, a set of properties. They have something in common, and that's this analogical reasoning, and that's absolutely the heart of scientific or any type of thinking, really. The analogical reasoning, as Hofstadter has said, is the fabric of cognition. Right? There's no such thing as something not being an analogy, right? You can't think without making analogies. Analogical thinking is how you get cross-domain knowledge, how you mix and match it, how you leverage the variation that exists in reality to come up with new inventions, to come up with new theories, right? So general patterns, universality, analogical thinking. This is very much stemming from a belief in the supernatural. Okay. And so I think that is again, just going back to this kind of causal aspect of the role of myth and magic in progress. So what about looking forward? So I've largely focused on looking back, right? I said, it's kind of narrative fallacy to say, well, whatever we have in science and technology now, we think about today's paradigm, today's thinking. That must have been where it came from, right? People must have been thinking like that, acting like that. And what I'm arguing in this episode is no, I don't think that's at all how they were thinking. And I think it's very beneficial that they weren't thinking like that. So what does that mean going forward? We've also got this kind of narrative fallacy going forward, right? Where we assume scientific thinking is going to lead to better progress, right? Let's be more logical, rational, objective, because we see the benefit. We see that as a pattern that spits out of science. So we tend to think, again, the pattern is the path. So let's take that path going forward, right? Using scientific thinking to attempt progress in science is actually a bigger, quote unquote, myth than magic, right? That's actually not the way forward, I would argue, because scientific thinking will lock you into something that doesn't necessarily propel you forward. And this is kind of hard to get our head around, right? Because we see the value of science. We see how it leads to a lot of great things. It's good to understand more about the world. It's good to think about it, logically, rationally, objectively, to leave the human bias out. And that's all great as the here and now, to appreciate that knowledge. But the idea that type of thinking is going to lead to more of that knowledge, I would say is a fallacy. I don't think that's true. Not that it never can, but I think I think it's highly problematic because, again, the targets need to be indirect, unrelated, and perhaps even impossible. Okay, so I've got this image, and I've created this for Twitter back in the day as well, that I posted on Twitter. You've got like the whole situation being very complex, and that your view of reality is just a very thin slice through that. Your understanding of a situation is very narrow. It's hard to know how much of what is connected to what and how it's going to affect things. If you just focus on the way science is now and assume that that's the way forward, that's going to be an extremely restricted view of things. And it's going to be hard to, quote unquote, think outside the box, essentially, which is really what that means, right? Is how do you get outside that box? How do you sample the space of possibilities if you're stuck in your paradigm? Well, the way you do that is to have targets that are quite unrelated, right? You have to believe in something that is, quote unquote, stupid. You have to have naivete. You have to have something that is outside your paradigm. And the more that you're stuck within the narrative of this is how things work, the harder that is to do, right? How do you unlock? So there's a self-dampening, self-arresting aspect to scientific thinking. Science is not bad. Science is great. It's a wonderful way to think about the world, to understand the world. And it's good to be objective and good to think of things kind of mechanistically and mechanically. But if you think that that's the path forward to improved mechanical thinking, to more objective thinking, I think that's actually wrong. I think, again, the target has to be indirect. When I say self-dampening, I mean that if you keep doing the thing you're doing, it starts to stop itself, right? It's kind of like the opposite of bootstrapping, right? Something about the way that you are doing things in your current paradigm is actually stopping or arresting the movement to continue forward. It hurts itself, okay? And it's hard for humans to kind of have, two things can be true at once, right? Science can be really good with the knowledge that it gives us, but it can also not be the way forward to increased scientific knowledge. The pattern is not the path. So I think the targets have to be indirect. So hopefully that made sense. So going forward, if we actually look at the world that we're in now, a lot of technology, and I've talked about this before, is becoming much more soft, right? So a lot softer, a lot less about the logic, rationality thinking. So a good example would be, in something like data science, where we're using these machine learning technologies those technologies are very black box. They're very, kind of mysterious. It's not about engineering a solution. It's not this deterministic connection between input and output. You're creating software that basically runs off on its own, right? You design the scaffolding, but then you say go, and you just give it this very high level target, and it just keeps running until it converges as close as possible to that target. And if you ask the engineers of these machine learning technologies, specifically deep learning, you say, well, how does that thing work? You can say at a high level how it's been put together. You can talk about the process that it uses to converge on a solution, but from a deterministic, peel back the layers, what's actually happening on the inside, nobody knows. Nobody knows, because that epistemic uncertainty is absolute, because now you're in the realm of complexity. You do not have access to that kind of information. So a lot of the technologies are moving in this direction now, that they're softer, they're higher level, they converge, they're more evolutionary. They're not explicitly programmed. They're not explicitly engineered. So the paradigm is changing about how we actually do things and how we aim towards it. They're only very, very higher, more abstract targets that are being used to produce the outcomes that we need. And we have to separate ourselves from this idea that we can know the internals of how something comes to be. And so there was this increased mystery, this increased opacity about what we do. We're now entering an environment that is much more complex in the information economy, and that means more mystery. And that means, what do humans do when they have more mystery, when they have more uncertainty? They start to get superstitious. They start to believe in things that they cannot see and they cannot perceive directly. Now, what does that mean? So I've got the slide now, a return to magic. So what I'm saying is that to continue to make progress forward, it's not going to be thinking scientifically, so to speak, right? It's going to be, we're going to have to get out of that paradigm and think much more non or unscientifically, right? We're going to need a kind of return to magic. Now, what does that mean? What does magic mean today? I mean, I don't think that's going to be alchemy. I don't think it's going to be return to the kind of magic that people necessarily believed in back in the day, although maybe there are some aspects that are the same, right? And I don't have the answer to that. I don't know what magic is supposed to mean today and going forward, but I do know that our targets are going to have to be very much indirect. They're going to have to be very unrelated to the thing that we think we want to achieve. They're going to be very high level, very abstract. We're going to have to move away from this idea that we can explicitly engineer the outcome of things. We're going to have to deal with massive levels of uncertainty, accept the absolute epistemic uncertainty things, accept the mystery, accept the fact that we cannot know how things come to be, but still be able to operate in that paradigm and push ourselves forward and enjoy the fruits of that labor. In other words, regardless of what we're doing or even why we're doing it, the byproduct of that effort will be continued progress. But if we step away from those indirect targets, if we step away from a sense of magic, we're going to be in this kind of self-dampening, process that thinks the pattern is the path when it's not, and that's going to halt the progress. So we need a kind of return to magic, return to the mystery, leverage uncertainty, okay, embrace myth while still remaining objective, appreciating the power of objective thinking as an understanding of the world, but not as a way forward necessarily. So what does it mean to embrace magic today? What does it mean to embrace myth, right? How can we ensure that our targets are unreachable so that we can continue to make progress going forward? And I don't have an answer for that in this episode. I think that's going to mean different things to different people. I think over the next few decades, it's going to be interesting to see how that uncertainty gets embraced, what myth and magic means in the, kind of the post-Enlightenment, what comes next. But some sense of quote unquote magic, will need to be returned to, because that really is how we deal with complex problem solving. And that's the paradigm we're entering. I've talked about coming full circle in other episodes, right? We've got everything before the Industrial Revolution, right? Kind of like pre-Enlightenment stuff, right? And then we've got the Industrial Revolution, which is very logical and rational and slide ruler, and everything kind of adds up deterministically. And now we're getting out of the Industrial Revolution into the information economy, which is very much back to unknown, complex, causally opaque situations. So whatever this means to you, and whatever this ends up meaning to people going forward, there will need to be a return to magic. So I hope you guys understood that episode. I know there's a lot of different concepts in there. But I think, again, that book, The Devil's Doctor, Paracelsus and the World of Renaissance Magic and Science, it was a really good read. It was interesting. Obviously, there's all kinds of other details that I didn't touch on in this episode about the life of Paracelsus and what he believed and how that motivated his exploration of the world. Go ahead and give that a read if you'd like. A couple other references in here. The Scientific American article that I referenced is called Why Rituals Work. And Nassim Taleb wrote an article called How to Be Rational About Rationality, which touches on some of those concepts, specifically that don't sleep under dead trees example. So thank you so much. Until next time, take care.